Okay, perfect. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Nasia. I'm the faculty director for this ICTR-sponsored series on clinical trials community of practice. Today, we are delighted to welcome as our speaker, Dr. Mary Ryan, who is an assistant professor with joint appointments in the departments of Population Health Sciences and Biostatistics and Medical Informatics. She joined the UW-Madison as a faculty member in 2023 and received her PhD and MS degrees in statistics from the University of California, Irvine, and her BA in Statistics and Bachelor of Journalism from the University of Missouri. She has previously held positions as a postdoctoral associate in biostatistics at Yale University and the Yale Center for Analytic Sciences. Her current research interests are in correlated data and the design and analysis of clinical trials with applications to Alzheimer's disease. Today, she'll be talking to us about pragmatic clinical trials, which has been a subject of a great deal of interest. And thank you so much, Dr. Ryan, for giving us your insights today. Now we'll turn it over to you.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. And thank everyone for being here to hear me talk about this. So I'm going to talk about pragmatic trials today, the what, why, and the how. I'm going to focus a lot of my time on the what and the why to kind of focus in on what we're talking about. And then the how, as we'll kind of see, will be a little bit more amorphous. Yeah, so just a brief outline. First, I'll talk about explanatory and pragmatic clinical trials, what they are, what the difference between them is, and why do we end up doing them. And then I'll transition into how we actually conduct pragmatic trials with a focus on rigor and then some issues that you might want to anticipate in planning your pragmatic trial. As we'll kind of see, there's no one way to have a pragmatic trial. So how to do the trial is kind of very context dependent, but I think there are some kind of general things that you can be thinking about in the process of setting up and designing your trial. And then if you have questions at any point, feel free to interrupt me or put something in the chat, and we can chat about it. But before we begin, I just wanted to kind of, I guess, center how I'm going to be talking about pragmatic trials with kind of a disclaimer that I'm a statistician. So I'm primarily going to be approaching this topic from a kind of a statistical and design perspective, because those are the things that I know the most about. We'll find that pragmatic trials are very much a team sport. When you're designing these, you want to have a lot of input from a lot of kind of interdisciplinary teams and members. So if you were to ask other types of scientists or trialists like implementation scientists or operations researchers or informaticists, they might approach this topic slightly differently and might focus on slightly different domains. So that's just to say I might not be able to answer all the questions that come up in the next hour, but I'm willing to bet there's probably someone on this call that can. So if there's something I don't know the answer to, someone else, and you do, please feel free to jump in. And then I also wanted to, at the start, point us out to a couple of additional resources that you might find helpful in this topic. One is that about 5 years or 4 years ago, this community of practice had a really great talk from Chris Linzell on pragmatic trials. And so that is a really great watch. And then secondly, the NIH has a pragmatic clinical trials collaboratory where they've created a living online textbook that is a really fabulous resource for learning more about kind of various types of pragmatic trials from a variety of different people. They have little textbook sections, they have links to kind of the seminal papers, they have explanatory videos, and it really covers, I feel like, a really broad range of topics that pragmatic trials touch. So that's, if you're interested in more detailed discussions, that's absolutely a kind of vital resource for this. But barring that, we can kind of dive right in and talk about what exactly are explanatory and pragmatic trials and why would you want to do them. So to start out, let's talk about what exactly are kind of explanatory clinical trials. And so to do that, I kind of want to pose a question to the group of what do you think about when someone says the phrase clinical trials to you? You can feel free to, we can take a beat to have people kind of put phrases in the chat if they feel like that. RCT, yeah, we think about randomization. An intervention with a control group, very good. Therapeutic interventions. Trial on human subjects as opposed to animals, very good. You think of participants. Awesome. These are good answers. So phrases that I usually think of when I think of clinical trials is first randomization, because I'm a statistician at heart. And that's usually what I'm most concerned about when we start out. So this is how we are able to kind of differentiate treatment effects between our intervention or control, which we'll get into in a minute. I think about fairly controlled settings. This is kind of the main difference between a clinical trial and an observational study, is that we're trying to exact some sort of control on our environment so we can tease out some of those more thorny effects between our study conditions. I also think about regulations, both those that govern how this trial is going to be run, as well as the standards of evidence that are going to need to be met in order for the intervention to be approved if that is a route it needs to go through. So kind of how are we going to meet those in the designing of this trial? I also came up in interim monitoring of trials. So usually I think about large phase 3 studies that you might have through FDA. Clinical trials don't necessarily need to be phase 3 studies, but that's something I always kind of think of. And then kind of at its heart, we're thinking of clinical trials as a way to investigate the efficacy of some sort of intervention, usually compared to some sort of control or placebo or standard of care. So that might be a group where absolutely nothing is happening, or it might be something like usual care. It can kind of depend on what our comparison wants to be. And in doing clinical trials, or kind of our usual concept of clinical trials, we have a question of interest that usually all of our trials boil down to, regardless of what intervention is happening or kind of the context of the trial. And that's basically, does this intervention work well enough and safely in quote unquote ideal settings? So this idea of, is the intervention efficacious? And how you define well enough and safely depends on the context of your trial, but essentially, what is the best case scenario for the effect of this intervention? And in asking that question of interest, I kind of posit that we have this sub goal of our trial, which is that we want to isolate the mechanistic pathway of this intervention. We want to explain exactly how that intervention impacts the outcome. And this is kind of easiest to do when the study condition is the only thing that is different between the groups that we're observing. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of helps us decide whether this intervention actually, works theoretically. But two, even in the cases where your trial returns a non-successful result, we can still use the information from that trial to basically gather evidence about whether that intervention is moving in the correct direction. Basically, are we targeting the correct mechanism to influence our outcome, or are we just totally off on a completely different path? And so those can be kind of the two questions and goals that we are looking at for an explanatory trial. We're trying to explain this connection, this path. And there are pros and cons to being able to do a trial in this way. Controlled trials lets us make a lot of assumptions and make a lot of comparisons that we wouldn't otherwise. So first, these controlled settings let us determine if the outcome differences between study arms is just due to the intervention as opposed to other things that might be influencing whether someone's on a study arm or what their outcomes might be. It also makes it a little bit easier to randomize our study arms if we're controlling the environment a little bit better. There's kind of fewer things that we have to be concerned about, I guess, on balancing on. Controlled settings let us determine if the outcome differences between study arms, we let us make that determination using fewer participants, because we're controlling the environment a little bit better. We have less variation going on. And so we can probably recruit fewer participants to our trials so it's a little bit more efficient. It lets us better understand relative safety endpoints because it can let us kind of isolate whether safety concerns are happening from the intervention or from something else that's going on. It can also be good for establishing, making sure, I guess, that any safety concern that we're essentially not putting people at undue risk if this intervention is potentially greater than minimal risk. And it basically helps us establish a best case scenario. So what is the effect of this intervention going to be when everything works perfectly, when everyone is taking the intervention exactly as it was designed to be taken? We are retaining everyone perfectly. We have lots of follow-up measurements on everyone involved, kind of, et cetera. But one of the main critiques of explanatory trials, or one of the things that people, I guess, have issues with, is that by controlling these settings very strictly, we end up with a research environment that sometimes has very little resemblance to what is happening in everyday practice. That basically, the way that the intervention is being administered in the trial is not going to match how it would actually be administered after the trial in actual care, which can be a problem because, then we can't necessarily say the effects we see in the trial are going to be the effects that we see once it's kind of implemented into practice. We also have critiques about differences in populations because the people who join clinical trials tend to be a very specific kind of person. They may be willing to take a little bit more risk. They also tend to be whiter, more affluent, better educated, kind of more centered around academic centers. And that might not be the population that you're really hoping to target in actual practice. You might have a lot of rural residents. You might be kind of trying to focus on a wider area. So you might be concerned that the effects you see in this trial population aren't necessarily going to be the same as those that you would see in kind of the population you would see in your everyday care. And kind of this general idea around, even though we have a lot of internal validity in explanatory clinical trials from these controlled settings, they lack an appropriate amount of external validity or generalizability to what we've been seeing. So this is just kind of a recognition that trial conditions don't match actual practice conditions. I don't like the phrase real world conditions because trials do exist in the real world. But this mismatch isn't necessarily a bad thing, kind of for the reasons that we outlined above. Controlled trial settings do have a purpose. But there are times when we want to move beyond that and start investigating the effects in actual practice. And so then we have to ask the question, well, what do we exactly do in that situation? And that's where this idea of pragmatic trials comes in. So pragmatic trials is this kind of trial framework where we're less concerned about isolating that mechanistic pathway between an intervention and an outcome. And we're more concerned about understanding if and how an intervention works in quote unquote usual conditions, kind of depending on how you define what usual conditions are. So basically, is this intervention effective? So explanatory and pragmatic trials are essentially asking two different sets of questions. Explanatory trials are focused on this question of, would this intervention ever worked in ideal conditions? Whereas pragmatic trials are asking the question of, will this intervention be useful in work in the present care context, in the present conditions that we have? And because of this, I think of pragmatic trials as being in a slightly more advanced stage of the research pipeline, because we're moving kind of beyond this need to observe this under very controlled conditions. So maybe moving beyond the kind of discovery phase into the actual kind of implementation of the intervention itself. And as you can kind of imagine, there is kind of a broad scale between very strict control and absolutely no control whatsoever. So there's kind of a spectrum between explanatory and pragmatic. And there are also a lot of kind of domains and facets on which you can exact control or kind of loosen up that control. So there's really no one way to have a pragmatic trial. I've kind of broken down the last table so I can kind of blow up the domains a little bit bigger. This is an example of kind of the 9 domains that we think of when we think of pragmatic trials, and the 9 areas in which you can have pragmatism or kind of control in your trial. Going into these a little bit more, the first one that we tend to think of in terms of pragmatic trials is expanding pragmatism in terms of eligibility. So who is selected to participate in the trial if you kind of had perfect recruitment resources? On the kind of more explanatory end, we would have very strict control over eligibility, so lots of inclusion criteria. I feel like in explanatory trials, we usually kind of exact this in terms of very few, if any, comorbidities, age restrictions, trying to restrict on kind of special populations to make sure that we are performing research on populations that, we're kind of trying to isolate that mechanistic pathway and making sure we're doing it in a safe kind of manner. Whereas on the more pragmatic side, we're tending toward more typical patients. Typical patients have multiple comorbidities. Typical patients can include special populations. And so on the more pragmatic end, we tend to move towards very minimal inclusion criteria. But there's also kind of a gray space in between. We can think of pragmatism in terms of recruitment. How are you actually getting participants into your trial? In a typical explanatory clinical trial, we think about outside recruitment resources. So maybe doing some recruitment in clinic, but also maybe using flyers, doing outreach, maybe doing ads to get people to come into the kind of enrollment setting. Whereas on the more pragmatic side, we tend to focus on recruitment in the usual healthcare settings. And we also tend to think of who is considered a participant in a slightly more broad sense, because participants could include patients, or depending on what your intervention is, it could also include healthcare providers or health systems themselves. So maybe gathering outcomes on kind of multiple dimensions here. We also think of pragmatism in terms of setting. Where is the trial being done? Is it being done at a very kind of specialized location that wouldn't necessarily be where the care would be administered after the trial? Or is it being given in the usual care setting? We think of pragmatism on organization. What kind of expertise and resources are needed to deliver the intervention? We think about pragmatism in terms of delivery. Is there a very kind of strict protocol that needs to be followed every single time in order to deliver that intervention? Or is the manner of delivery left more up to the care provider? We think of pragmatism on adherence. Are we putting strict guardrails in place to make sure that people adhere to what the intervention is exactly? Or we don't have any special measures necessarily to enforce adherence. Not necessarily that we don't measure adherence, but we're not necessarily ensuring that high adherence is being followed. And we also have pragmatism in terms of measurement. How closely are those participants followed up? Do we have a lot of extraneous visits and measurements that are happening to follow up their measurement like we would in an explanatory trial? Or are we using more kind of commonly gathered information like EHR data or administrative data to be able to track people after that kind of usual care interaction? Same thing for outcomes. Do we have extra kind of outcome data collection that we're doing, or are we using the current data collection systems that we have? And to what extent are all the data in the trial being included? Are we really filtering down to the most compliant participants, or are we using more of an intent to treat analysis? So some settings in which you might consider what I call like a pragmatic-ish kind of trial. One might be that you have an intervention that's shown to be efficacious in specific trial conditions, but it's unclear whether that holds true when you relax eligibility or adherence criteria. You might be interested in a pragmatic trial when you're trying to investigate what the effect of an intervention is on an outcome that's more relevant to participants, or maybe an outcome that's just more routinely collected and maybe has less patient and provider burden to collect. You might be interested in what happens when this intervention is administered by a wider range of provider types, so maybe not necessarily administered by a very specific specialist, but maybe PCPs, nurse practitioners, et cetera. Maybe you want to compare two different standards of care that have both already been approved. And maybe you're just trying to determine whether one is superior to the other. They've never really been compared directly. Or maybe you're trying to determine non-inferiority, just whether they both work about the same, but maybe one has extra benefits in terms of patient or provider burden or cost, for example. And then finally, maybe you want to understand how a new training in your system might improve process metrics. And so lots of different scenarios with lots of different types of interventions. And for some of these, they should require some sort of previous explanatory trial work. So these are the ones that kind of boxed in red. These are ones that involve some sort of intervention that could potentially involve more than minimal risk to research participants. And I think a lot of times when we talk about pragmatic trials, we talk about them in terms of maybe comparing standards of care. But before we get to standard of care, we need to have an explanatory trial to make it standard of care. So in a lot of cases, the pragmatic trial might come after and build on top of explanatory work that's already been done. But in other cases, you might have pragmatic work that can kind of be done without a lot of previous explanatory work. So depending on the type of intervention you're doing and depending on if it is kind of minimal risk, if you have a more training-based intervention that's more for satisfaction improvement and things like that, you wouldn't necessarily need to, or it wouldn't necessarily be feasible to do previous explanatory work. And it might also be, the intervention is some sort of assessment that's being administered. And so the actual mechanistic pathway between the assessment and the outcome is maybe a little bit more difficult to do in a truly explanatory setting. And so you really just have the option to do it in a pragmatic framework integrated into the actual care system. So kind of multiple ways to get to a pragmatic trial. And so when you ask the question, should I be doing an explanatory or pragmatic trial? I feel like it's my job as a statistician to say it depends. And it should depend on what your research question actually is. Are you trying to get at that mechanistic pathway? Or are you trying to understand how that intervention works in usual care conditions? And I think it also depends on the nature of your intervention. Has there already been previous explanatory work done on the intervention? Do you need to establish safety for the intervention? And what, if any, regulations need to be satisfied in order for that intervention to be approved? Things to consider. And another question to ask yourself kind of in that process would be, do I want to do a pragmatic trial, or do I actually just want to make an explanatory trial more generalizable? Both, I think, are valid, and both can take similar steps to do that, but whether it has the explicit pragmatic label or whether it has the usual RCT label can, kind of depend on your context. So how exactly do we go about asking ourselves that question? We can do this in a lot of ways. We can have discussions on our study team. One tool that we found particularly helpful is the precise, I call it Precise 2, I've heard it also called Precis 2, which is this kind of guided worksheet diagram visualization that maps those pragmatic domains that we were talking about earlier onto a wheel, and visualizes the intensity that your trial is pragmatic in that domain. So you take these domains and you score your trial from 1 to 5 on each domain, with 1 being your trial being very explanatory in that domain, with 5 being your trial being very pragmatic in that domain. So kind of patient-reported outcomes happening here. These are subjective scores. They're only as useful as you are truthful to yourself about how you're doing in that domain. And what you would essentially do with a Precise 2 tool is talk about your trial, design it, then take it over the Precise 2 tool, score it, discuss it with your team, and then potentially refine. Generally, pragmatic trials will score high in more than one domain. So one domain does not a pragmatic trial make. So for example, hopefully both pragmatic and explanatory trials are using outcomes that are relevant to participants. So you would maybe need to target multiple areas in order to make your trial truly pragmatic. But the goal with the Precise tool isn't necessarily to maximize the circle, to just blow out every domain, because it's important to recognize that all trials can't be all things all the time. And you might not necessarily need pragmatism in every single domain to answer your particular research question. So really the Precise 2 is meant to help you align your study design with your study intent, and help guide you through asking questions about, this is what I meant to do with this study. Is how I designed it actually meeting up to that intent necessarily? So an example of a use of a Precise tool is 2 tool is in the lumbar imaging with reporting of epidemiology study, or LIRE, which was an NIH pragmatic trial collaboratory demonstration project. And the idea behind the LIRE study was to evaluate basically putting benchmark prevalence data into routine spinal imaging reports, and then understanding whether kind of putting that data in those reports would impact spine-related healthcare utilization afterwards, and opioid prescribing trends. And this was designed as a step-wedge cluster randomized trial, which I'll get into in a little bit, where they randomized about 100 primary care clinics across 4 health systems to start using the input of this data into their reports. And they ended up randomizing a bit over 250,000 usual care patients. And you can see on the right the actual Precise schematic that they published in their trial protocol. And you can see that it's actually not, completely pragmatic in every single domain. Particularly, their strengths were in recruitment, follow-up, and adherence and delivery. So had strong pragmatism in recruitment because they were recruiting from the usual care setting, people just coming into the clinics. And they had very low kind of eligibility requirements for being a part of the study. They were trying to just capture anyone that was coming in to have spinal imaging done. There was really little extra follow-up data that was being done. They were mostly doing follow-up via administrative and EHR records, so very pragmatic in that sense. They really didn't have a lot of guardrails happening in terms of people adhering to including the data in the reports, because that was mostly coming from the imaging centers and not necessarily from the providers themselves. And then those results were being integrated directly into the delivery of care. So there was going to be very little difference in how the intervention was going to be provided in the trial versus what would happen after the trial was done in the usual care setting. Slightly lower pragmatic scores on terms of outcome. So healthcare utilization is not exactly a top of mind outcome for a lot of patients, but it's still a useful outcome. So it's scored a little bit lower there. So kind of an example of you don't have to have completely, entirely patient relevant outcomes in order for them to be useful. And then slightly more explanatory scoring on organization and setting because the intervention represented an inherent change in care delivery. So you had to kind of tweak that care organization. And there was also a level of expertise that needed to happen in order for the delivery to happen, because providers needed to actually understand the data that was provided in the reports in order for it to be helpful and useful for them delivering care. One question I think that a lot of people have when they think about pragmatic trials is, when does this exactly cross over into being quality improvement? So I had trouble placing where this slide was going to go, but one kind of bonus part of pragmatic trials and trying to integrate or studying an intervention that's very integrated into a care system is that you can utilize all of the data that you collect normally to get estimates for design parameters, which is usually what I'm very concerned about, because in explanatory trials, we're introducing a new intervention into a new setting. And so there might not be a lot of good data collection to help guide necessarily what our variation is going to look like and things like that. Whereas in healthcare systems, we collect lots of EHR data. We can kind of target that and use that information. So all you have to do is identify those sources of variation. And if you're working just within your own health system, you know that these estimates are going to be fairly accurate, as you know, provided that nothing major is going to change between when you kind of get the data and when you actually implement the trial. But one danger of this, and one danger of being super integrated into a particular health system, is that you are going to design a trial and design an intervention that is so tailored to your current system or workflow that it's going to be very difficult to generalize those results to using the intervention in other systems. So that's kind of the opposite of what we were going for in the initial purpose of pragmatic trials. We were kind of wanting to do these to make sure that we could take the results of the trial and generalize them to actual care. So there can be a really fine line between what is considered a pragmatic trial and what is considered quality improvement work. And I think where you can make that differentiation is basically, who are you doing this work for? And there have been several papers that have been written about this. I like to include this quote because I feel like it was very succinct in that quality improvement work is designed to change local processes to achieve accepted standards of care, whereas pragmatic research is designed to determine the standards themselves. So were you really doing this work to make decisions about how to provide care within your local network, or are you hoping to do this more broadly for maybe other networks that look like yours but aren't your network exactly? There is a very useful table that can compare the conditions under several different domains of kind of regular explanatory clinical trials, pragmatic trials, and quality improvement work to kind of ask, where does the research fall in terms of this question? I think the most important one to focus in on whether you're trying to determine if you're doing pragmatic trial work or quality improvement work is basically, what is the purpose of the work? If you're doing the work to create generalizable knowledge that improves care, like locally and for kind of policy decisions, you're probably doing pragmatic trial work. But if you're focused on improving care just locally, that's more QI work necessarily. Any questions here before I move on? Okay. Barring none, let's move on to, how do we actually do a pragmatic trial? We know what it is. We know why we're doing one. So how do we do them? And what are all of the fun issues that are probably going to come up that we need to think about ahead of time? So a lot of the things I hear about in terms of pragmatic trials center around the rigor of the trial itself. So I kind of listed some myths about pragmatic trials that I've kind of generally heard. One is that pragmatic trials are less rigorous than explanatory trials, so you can't trust the results that come out of them. You might hear someone say, I can't control this factor, so I can't do an explanatory trial. But if I do a pragmatic trial, I can just ignore the fact that I can't control that factor, and I don't have to do anything about it. And I also hear things about, I don't need to collect individual or patient consent in a pragmatic trial. And none of these are necessarily true. So just like you can have a poorly designed explanatory trial, you can also have poorly designed pragmatic trials. And pragmatic trials are not really an excuse to do bad research. So pragmatic doesn't necessarily mean less rigorous work. And I argue that it often requires a lot more effort and forethought to be internally and externally valid in a pragmatic trial setting. Because by giving up control on a lot of the environmental factors that you would have in an explanatory trial, this means that we are having to keep our eye on a lot more spinning plates within the pragmatic trial setting in order to be able to sift out valid results. So just because we aren't necessarily controlling for it doesn't mean that we're not measuring it, and doesn't mean that we're not observing it, and doesn't mean that we're not thinking about how it's going to influence our outcomes. And so because of this, there really isn't one way to do a pragmatic trial. It really depends on what your question is, where you need your pragmatism within the trial, and what your resource or logistical constraints are going to be within the course of that trial. Basically, what is feasible to do and what is not feasible to do. So a brief note on consent. I am not an expert on consent, but I do think this is kind of important to note, is that regardless of whether your trial is pragmatic or not, you're still doing research. So the common rule still applies. I think this is kind of the main difference between pragmatic work and quality improvement work, is that you do still need to gain consent. And so not only might you be considering getting informed consent from individual patients, you might also be needing to get consent from health professionals or providers, depending on where the intervention is being implemented, who is being randomized, and what outcomes are being collected. A difference that we usually see in terms of pragmatic trials and consent is that usually in pragmatic trials, you're looking at interventions that are on the whole lower risk than those that are usually being tested at explanatory trials. And that's usually because there's been explanatory trial work that's been happening before. There is some pragmatic work that happens that you do have less than minimum or greater than minimal risk, but on the whole, it tends to be lower. And so you have kind of more pragmatic trials that might meet the no more than minimal risk threshold and kind of meet the kind of guidelines where you can ask an IRB to grant you a waiver or alteration of consent because of that minimal risk, and because you might have sufficient practical burden for gathering that consent within your trial. So usually this threshold is that the research couldn't feasibly be done if full informed consent for all individuals needed to be gathered. And I feel like a lot of times in pragmatic trials, this happens because the trials are very, very large, and occasionally because asking for informed consent would impact, it would basically give people self-selection bias into study condition groups in some cases. So those are particular cases in which you might be able to look at a waiver of informed consent for your pragmatic trial. But there are also plenty of pragmatic trials where the IRB really does push for full informed consent as well. So it's not really a given that you're going to have to, you're going to be able to ignore this. And this is something that you should kind of take into consideration when you're planning your trial and kind of understand whether it's going to be feasible for you to be able to do this or not. And second thing I want to note is that pragmatic trials are really a team sport because they often involve the integration of an intervention into a system or a care setting. I feel like they really require the expertise of most, if not all, of the system components in the design of that trial. So this can involve research versus operations teams. It can involve individuals that are going to be key to understanding the feasibility of that intervention or the adherence concerns among people who are going to implement that intervention. It involves people who are going to be really key in identifying potential breakage points. So where is kind of along feasibility, where is this not going to work? Where are we going to potentially see some issues? Also in terms of kind of information systems as well. Individuals who are going to be knowledgeable about study retentions of both participants and system staff. And people who are going to be knowledgeable about the integration of data collection procedures. And getting buy-in from these multiple components in the planning stage, or at least very early on in the planning of your pragmatic trial, is going to ensure a much smoother running during the active trial phase. I feel like a lot of times in explanatory trials, you can have a slightly more specialized kind of core study team because you can control the environment a little bit more, because you're really focused on how this integrates into a system here. You really want to thoroughly understand how that system works and what the impact of this is going to be on this system. So you want to kind of know what all the issue points are at the very beginning and get that buy-in and get that feedback so you can plan for it ahead of time. To kind of talk about some broad types of pragmatic trials kind of briefly, I break this down into basically who was randomized in the trial and when the intervention is received. And these are just kind of some examples. You might have pragmatic individually randomized trials where you have individuals that are randomized to study conditions, and then the participants don't interact with each other after randomization happens. So this is your kind of classic RCT kind of setting. An area that I do a lot of work in is in cluster randomization, where instead of randomizing individuals to a study condition, you're instead randomizing larger groups of trial participants as a group to a study condition. This can be a setting where the intervention is administered kind of at the group level that goes on down, or it can still be administered to individual participants. And you can have outcomes that are measured either at the individual level or kind of the greater kind of cluster level. So you might think of this as kind of randomizing providers and all of the patients that provider sees, or maybe randomizing a clinic along with all of the providers and all of the patients who are part of that clinic. You could also have something like an individually randomized group treatment trial or a partially nested design, where essentially you kind of combine these two. You individually randomize trial participants to a study condition, but then you expect the participants to interact after that randomization. So you try to group together the participants who are going to be interacting. So a very classic case of a IRGT is interventions that involve some sort of group classes or group administration, where you individually randomize those people to the classes, but they're going to be taking part in that intervention together as a group. And then finally, you can have multiple ways in which, or multiple timings in which that intervention is received to the randomization units. You can have a kind of single time period design where you do a baseline measurement and you do a measurement kind of at the end of the study. Or you can do something like a multi-period design, where the outcome is going to be measured on trial participants at multiple instances. And you might have people experiencing both trial conditions throughout the course of the trial. So just some kind of examples of types of pragmatic trials. And these are also just examples of trials. Generally, you can have these also be explanatory trials. So on the left, we have our kind of very classic single period individually randomized trial. And then on the right, we have our kind of cluster trials where you have multiple clusters that are randomized to treatment conditions that involve multiple participants within each cluster. And then you have kind of multi-period designs where you might have clusters that are measured at multiple time periods, although they stay on the same study condition. Or you might have settings where clusters experience both trial conditions, like a crossover design like you see up here on the top left, or a step wedge design like you see down here on the bottom right. So you can kind of combine elements of who and when into the actual design of your trial. What you choose depends on what your outcome is, what your intervention is, and kind of what you're trying to get at. But you can get a little bit more creative, I feel like, in the design of these trials when you're doing a pragmatic trial. So those are the basic types of designs. I wanted to take this opportunity to move more into what I'm usually concerned about when I'm designing a pragmatic study as a statistician, and questions that I feel like are helpful to ask yourself um, when you are in the design phase to kind of make your pragmatic trial as valid internally and externally as you could want. So usually one of the first questions I ask are, what are our sources of variation in this trial going to be? Because we're in this pragmatic setting, we are controlling less of the environment. And so we need to understand what outside of the intervention could impact our primary outcome, what things could impact intervention adherence, and do we anticipate any intervention non-adherence? Is that something we need to measure? And basically, trying to identify all of these sources of things that could be influencing what's going on in the trial. Questions about whether we can actually measure those things or not, whether we can feasibly measure them given the kind of systems that we have, and can we reliably keep track of them. So what those sources of variation are going to be is going to highly depend on what type of intervention and trial and setting that you're in. Another question I tend to ask is, are we going to have comparable units in study conditions? This comes up a lot in cluster randomized trials, where because we have a less controlled environment, we need to be more aware of unit heterogeneity. So we need to understand that if we randomize clinics to study conditions, are we going to have balance on the characteristics of those clinics in the study conditions, or should we be using some sort of stratified or constrained randomization? We're probably going to have to think of more things to do stratified and constrained randomization on than we would necessarily have in an explanatory trial, because we have a broader diversity of people that are participating in the pragmatic trial. I also think about if we are going to see changes in our population over the course of the study. So are we starting and ending the trial with the same patients and providers and units, or are we getting a new sample at each time points? And are those samples going to be comparable across time points? So it's this idea of we could start our trial with the same people and follow them all the way to the end of the study through multiple observations, like you would in kind of longitudinal sampling. Usually we have one population, we're just going to follow them the whole way. But you could also have a setting where you're doing cross-sectional sampling throughout the trial. So you're kind of capturing who those clinics serve at a particular time point, and then continually observe that clinic with new sets of patients at each time point. So in this case, you would really want to keep an eye on the seasonal effects of your particular patient population, impacts of policy on who is able to be a part of your target population kind of throughout the course of the trial, et cetera. Moving more into questions about the actual treatment effect that we're trying to measure. I also like to think about exactly the nature of the intervention. Are we going to need some sort of training to be a part, like, to actually implement the intervention? Do we have to do training sessions? What are the logistics and resources that we have behind that training? Are we going to be able to train everyone up at once and just kind of let it go? Or are we going to have a training team that needs to do multiple sessions in order to cover our whole system? And then after that, is there going to need to be a kind of in-place learning period for the intervention to take full effect? Do people kind of need to get used to doing this new intervention in the care setting to get it up to full speed? In which case, you might consider something like a washout period between your usual care and your full intervention. And then with that, do we anticipate any time varying treatment effects? So for example, in something like a step wedge design, where you're going to have groups that are going to be on the intervention for longer periods of time, do you think that the effect of the intervention is going to increase with time on study? Or do you anticipate that maybe you might have a really large initial effect that will kind of taper off with time? So people are very adherent to it at the beginning and then kind of taper off once they've gotten used to it, and they don't really care about it so much anymore. Those kind of need to be integrated. And then finally, some questions about, do we anticipate participants on one study condition contaminating the outcomes of participants on another study condition? What is our likelihood for unanticipated changes in the trial? And is our intervention going to be static, or do we expect it has a possibility of changing or evolving with time? So on the note about study contamination, one of our major assumptions in kind of classic individually randomized trials is that the outcome of someone on a study condition isn't going to affect the outcome of someone else on another study condition. This is met in a lot of cases, but there's also a lot of cases where this isn't going to be the case. So for example, in vaccine trials, this is a very kind of classic example. Vaccinated participants are hopefully going to reduce the risk of an unvaccinated participant from getting an infection if they interact with each other, because there are going to be fewer kind of vectors from which an unvaccinated participant could kind of pick up the infection. So this is going to reduce the differences between treated and untreated groups and kind of drive your treatment effect toward the null. So in this case, it might be a good idea to think about non-individualized randomization to kind of help separate the individuals in the control group and the individuals in the treatment group, and prevent them from interacting and influencing their outcomes. However, I feel like this can get, in kind of explanatory trials, is a little bit easier sometimes, but it can get kind of complicated when you're talking about interventions within health systems, particularly because I think care teams can be pretty complex, and you can have a lot of cross-pollination between care teams. So you might have kind of you have a lot of overlap in your groups, and it's hard to kind of isolate one group that is not necessarily going to interact with another group. So for example, you can have patients that interact with multiple aspects of a care system at multiple time points. And so understanding whether you're going to have potential interaction between your study arms and what exactly your teams and system looks like, I feel like is really important in pragmatic trials, and whether that interaction is actually going to meaningfully influence outcomes or adherence. And this will kind of depend on the level at which the intervention is enacted on. Is it administered to participants? Is it administered to providers who administer to participants? Is it a training that happens at the system level that kind of affects everyone, that kind of moves through the system? Also asking questions about whether participants can access or self-implement an intervention if they choose to do so. So if you kind of are doing an intervention that is more publicly available, would a participant be able to just kind of do it on their own if given the choice? And at what level are you measuring your trial outcomes necessarily? A note on unanticipated changes. I feel like this is one of the biggest differences between explanatory trials and pragmatic trials. All trials can be impacted by unanticipated changes. We should kind of be future-proofing against them, but in pragmatic trials, because they're often embedded within external systems that are subject to change, and because they exist without the kind of beyond the confines of the trial, they're more prone to having these changes happen and maybe being impacted by them. So we need to do a little bit more anticipatory work about those changes and kind of understand what our game plan is going to be and how it might affect the trial. So you could expect changes in the study or target population in your trial. So you might have new diagnostic criteria that come out that widens the target population that you weren't necessarily anticipating when you started the trial. Or you might have policy changes that impact who is able to access care. So for example, Medicaid expansions or Medicaid retractions would impact who exactly is being a part of your system. You might have unanticipated changes in actual healthcare systems. So you might have changes in leadership or site champions that bring change in site commitment. Or you might have personnel turnover or extended leave. So people can leave positions, people can go on paternity leave or maternity leave, how is that turnover going to impact how your trial runs? And you might have changes in kind of practice standards or regulations. So this might happen when your two standards of care that you're comparing suddenly becomes one. One of the standards is suddenly elevated above another or dropped. What would you necessarily do at that point? And so in pragmatic trials, you really need to anticipate these potential changes and future-proof as much as you can against them. You can't always because they're unanticipated, but think about the creation of participant or obligation agreements among sites, so everyone kind of understands what the workload and participation requirements of the trial is going to be, so you don't necessarily have site dropout because they didn't understand how much of a burden it was going to be a part of the trial. Try not to let the success or momentum of the trial rest on one person. So this can be particularly challenging when you have one really strong site champion, and then all of a sudden that site champion leaves for some reason, and there isn't really the enthusiasm to participate for everyone else in the site, in which case you might have site dropout. And then really try to measure and keep tabs on your population changes, just so you kind of understand how the changes are necessarily impacting what's going on in the trial. On top of this, you might have intervention changes or disruptions, depending on what your intervention actually is. So really consider whether your intervention is something that's kind of completely localized within the trial, or something that's external, kind of being brought in or given access to. So do you as the study team control the nature of the intervention? Is it static, or are you just controlling access to kind of a third-party tool? Because external interventions may not necessarily always stay the same. So this is an issue that can come up with software tools that are implemented, because software can be updated. And these updates can unintentionally disrupt workflow integrations. Major updates to software can kind of fundamentally change the nature of an intervention if they're big enough. And you might not necessarily be given prior notice or any notice of the update. So kind of try to think ahead of time whether this is going to be an issue that you need to consider, and then create a plan for basically documenting those changes or monitoring them. So this might involve kind of semi-real-time monitoring to help you identify issues or bugs that can be fixed before the trial is over. This might not always be possible if you have big data lags, especially if you have maybe multiple systems that are a part of the trial, or if you have data quality issues that you were really planning to clean up after the trial is over, but when you're in the course of the trial, it's difficult to have that data be up to quality. And in the case where you can't have real-time monitoring of kind of secondary outcomes for these, you want to think about having or trying to get at least precise documentation on the type or the timing of the change to kind of help you after the trial is done, explore the impact of those changes on your treatment effects, or maybe do some kind of sensitivity analysis groups for it necessarily. And finally, just another key on documentation. I feel like this is really a key to generalizability in pragmatic trials. It's good for all trials, but especially in pragmatic trials, because it's going to help you document basically what your workflow and care systems look like, even when you're conducting that trial across multiple systems. Because pragmatic trials are all about understanding how an intervention works in usual conditions. You need to understand that your usual conditions might not be everyone else's. So this can help you bridge the gap between quality insurance work and generalized and pragmatic work. So you need to do that synthesis of your system and acknowledge where your system's unique and what similarity it shares with your peers in order to help others be able to understand how that intervention might work kind of in their own setting. So kind of in conclusion, pragmatic trials can be really useful frameworks for investigating interventions in the context of usual care. And if done correctly, loosening those controlled settings can give us important information about an intervention's effectiveness, generalizability, and practical utility. But successful implementation and running of these pragmatic trials really require meticulous planning, interdisciplinary team support, and strong stakeholder support. So I think I've just finished up on time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ryan. We do have one question in the chat. And the participant is asking, do you have an example of this key difference from the table you showed? Who develops the study questions? Is it the researchers, clinical decision makers, clinicians, administrators, and policymakers?
I think an example of this would be kind of going back to that question of what is your research question in an explanatory trial. The research question is more around mechanistic pathways and kind of how does this intervention work in ideal conditions. So that would be kind of like a researcher-based question. We're trying to get at like a very specific hypothesis between the intervention and the outcome. Whereas in pragmatic trials, it's more about the effect of that intervention or the outcome is maybe more stemming from multiple stakeholders. So it's not just a very kind of researcher-based question, the biological mechanism, but it might be questions that have been workshopped among both researchers and clinicians, maybe also getting patient advocates in there to understand the relevantness of that outcome to their experience of the condition, and then kind of understanding of how we would be able to track that outcome within the system. Whereas in QI, I think it's the question is more slightly more administrative than that. You kind of maybe remove the patient relativeness of that outcome. So maybe more focused on healthcare utilization or process outcomes necessarily.
Okay, and it looks like we have one more question. If you can address it very quickly. Can you address the acceptance of these trials at granting agencies and journals?
I think for that, it depends on how the rigorousness, I guess, with which you design the trial. And I think in order for the results of the trial and the trial itself to be accepted by granting agencies and journals, is you need to really do a lot of forethought about how the relaxing of those controlled environment assumptions is going to impact your ability to observe actual effects of the intervention. So it kind of, I think, goes back to really thinking about not letting up on the rigor of the trial, even though you're in more of a usual care setting. With that said, I feel like there are a lot of benefits of kind of framing it as a pragmatic trial for granting agencies, because you're able to talk about how the outcome is more relevant to patients, how there's going to be a smaller gap between the results of the trial and how it would be implemented afterwards. So I think you can play up some of those parts, but you do need to also be thinking about the kind of what do we lose by relaxing the strict control that we would have had in an explanatory trial. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you again, Dr. Ryan. We really appreciate your talk, and everyone will be sending out slides and a link to a recording of this presentation. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next month.